So it's what was part 4 on the outline, the third of our 4 topics. And it has to do with power, class, and the state. So let me begin dealing with that. The issue of power has been, for at least 300 years, the dominant issue in Western societies. What do I mean? I mean that by power, I refer to the question of how a society organizes the rules of behavior. Who is going to give orders? Who is going to take orders? How are the orders to be given? How is the right to give orders to be distributed in the society? What are all the rules governing who makes decisions? Who has to live with those decisions? Who participates, etc.? These questions of power have been the dominant questions for 300 years. The symbol, or the signal, if you like, that power is such a central issue has been the importance of words like freedom, understood in terms of not being subject to power, being free of subjection to power. Democracy, which is about how you organize the power to make decisions. Notice, freedom, democracy, liberty. These are all terms that have to do, if you think about it, with the organization and the distribution of power. Take a step back and ask yourself the question, why would people be so interested in the question of power? If you took the time to study, for example, European history before 300 years ago, you will discover that they weren't all that interested in power. They were much more interested in religion. They were much more interested in a whole host of issues, not power. There's something special that happens about 300 or 400 years ago that makes power the central issue. One of the best writers on this subject, a French writer, much influenced by Marxism, but not strictly speaking a Marxist, but you've heard of him, I would guess, was Michel Foucault. Spelled this way, for those of you that are not familiar with French spelling, Foucault, Michel Foucault. If you read any of his modern major books, and they've all been translated into English and are available in paperback, you'll see he's fascinated by the changed way of thinking that happens about 300 or 400 years ago, having mostly to do with power. So he writes about prisons. We didn't have those things before. We developed a place to put a person who violates the rules that govern political our behavior in the community. And we have to segregate them, put them in a special place where they can't do the bad thing, which is to break the rules. And it's fascinating. It's called Discipline and Punish, if I remember the name of the book. But there's all kinds of studies. He shows how we had to develop a different concept of sexuality, more later in his books. He developed a concept of psychological disturbance, a concept of illness. All those things developed then in a radically different way, if they even existed before. So power became very important 300 or 400 years ago. Why? Because it was the language, the theory, the ideology in which a basic social change happened in Europe. And that social change was the transition from an economic system called feudalism to an economic system called capitalism. Let's review quickly so we all know what I mean. Roughly 1,000 years, roughly 500 to 1,500 AD in Europe, there was an economic system called feudalism. In a feudal system, there were basically 2 positions a human being has. You were either a serf or you were a lord. If you were a serf, you had a place on this earth that you were born into by virtue of your parents, and you cultivated the land in a place that you were born into. Okay? If you were a lord, you presided over an area of land on which were positioned lots of these serfs. And here's how the economy worked, roughly. 3 days a week, the serf worked on the piece of land that he or she had inherited. It was a highly male-structured and male-dominated environment. It was really the men. The women were adjuncts to the men and clearly subordinate. So the man worked with his wife, of course, 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, on the land they had been born into. The other 3 days of the week, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they went to the land of the Lord, where there were no serfs living, and they worked on that. Sunday, of course, Christians, they rested. The first 3 days, when you worked on a little piece of land that was yours, you were assigned to, you kept the fruits of your labor. That's how you lived. You and your family kept whatever you could grow, whatever you could cultivate, whatever animals you could sustain in those 3 days of the work. The fruit of your 3 days of labor on the land of the Lord belonged to the Lord. To use Marxian language, the first 3 days, the serf did necessary labor because the serf retained the fruits of that labor. The second 3 days, the serf was doing surplus labor because the fruits of that automatically belonged to the Lord on whose land he worked. That's how people lived, more or less, for 1,000 years. There were variations we don't need to spend time on. That system lasted a long time, but around 1600, it fell apart. And again, very interesting story, we don't have the time. As it fell apart, the large, they were called manors, the large units where there was a lord and serf. By the way, a lord could have 20 serfs. A lord could have 20 villages, each with 500 serfs. It could be very large. And everything in between. What began to happen as the system broke down is the lord could not enforce the labor of the serfs. The serfs couldn't stand the life they had if half of their labor went to somebody else, so they would run away. You know the stories. No one has ever explained to you what they were, but for example, one of the famous stories of the serfs who run away because they can't stand a feudalism that's breaking down is the story of Robin Hood. You become a bandit in the forest because you have to live somehow, and you no longer can live in the old way. By the way, in most of European feudalism, just so you understand, there is no private property. The serf does not own the land he works on, nor does the lord. There is no property. The church would denounce anybody who talked about my land. And here's the reason. Roman Catholic doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, for those of you who need to go back, or Augustine. Human beings cannot own the land because God put the land here. God put the people here. For a person to take unto himself what is God's product is a blasphemy beyond words. It can't be. Private property in land is an anathema, a sin, a blasphemy. Very important to understand this. So land was a collective, there was no private property in land. Here's something else there wasn't. No hired labor. Nobody paid another person to work. Wage labor didn't exist. That was not how anything was organized. Feudalism doesn't have wage labor. Feudalism is a personal relationship that lasts through the generations between one group of people, serfs, who've entered into a relationship, I talked to you about that last time, because it's like modern marriage, with a lord. And that relationship imposed on both parties their behavior that in Marxian theory we analyze as the production of a surplus by one group, the serfs, and its receipt by another group, the lords. What did the lords do with the serfs? Very similar to what we did 2 weeks ago with the corporation. The lord had to distribute this surplus he got from the serfs to keep this system going. just like a board of directors of a corporation has to distribute the profits, the surplus they get, to keep the system going. How did the feudal lords do it? Just a reminder. They gave a portion of it to the church, because it's expensive to build a cathedral. It's expensive to house, feed, and clothe the Monsignor and the priests and the nuns and all the other personnel of the church. But they were crucial because they said to the mass of serfs, this is how God wants us to live. You are to be a serf. When life is over, you will sit on the right hand of God like anybody else. But for the meanwhile, until you get there, you are a serf, he is a lord, and this is how it ought to be. So for you to reject the role of the serf would be to set yourself against God, which probably isn't a good idea. It's really very important. What else did the Lord do with the surplus? He had a bunch of gentlemen with long sticks called lances. And to make them look very scary, he put them on a horse and wrapped them in metal. Scared the shit out of the serf. That's the point. Because if the serf was interested in not being a serf anymore, he'd get a visit from 3 very large people on a big horse wrapped up in foil. And this was a very scary sight. Plus, if you really misbehaved, they would stick you with the stick. Not a good idea. But of course, a horse has to be fed. A knight, that's what they were called, had to be fed. His horse had to be housed. The foil was expensive, all that. So this was another use of the surplus. So this was a very complicated system, and in case you're wondering, not much of a market. No need for markets. Most of these manors were self-sufficient. The serfs, part of the serfs made grain, part of the serfs raised chickens, part of the serfs, spun wool into material. These were largely self-sufficient. There was some trade, but the point is, you didn't need markets. That's not the way this was organized. So, you with me? No private property, no wage labor, no markets, no profits, none of that. It's a very different system, not capitalism. It lasted in Europe 1,000 years. It has lasted in other parts of the world longer. By comparison, capitalism is relatively young. But in the 15th century, for a whole host of reasons, this feudalism fell apart. And serfs kind of took off on their own. Lords could not restrain them. Lords had gotten into all kinds of trouble, debts, all kinds of problems. And again, we don't have the time to do it, a new system begins to emerge, radically different. It does have private property. Everything becomes private property. The land, the machines, the animals. It also has a completely new way of people getting together to produce. There's no swearing ceremony. There's no personal relationship. Instead of all of that, a simple cash transaction. You come to work here at this time and you do what I tell you, and at the end of the week, I'm going to give you some money. Other than that, I don't care who you are, what you do, or whether you drop dead tomorrow, as long as I got someone else to give money to have them come work here. Instead of the relationships that held together feudalism, you have an exchange. I give you my capacity to work, you give me money. Radically different. So suddenly, there's a market for labor power, for people buying and selling their capacity to work. Everything that gets produced goes through a market. Didn't have that in feudalism. Everything. There's no direct passage of a good that's produced from the producer to the consumer. Think of a feudal village. A bunch of serfs make bread. And so they're the bread makers in the village. So there has to be a mechanism. So when they finish making 400 loaves, it gets distributed to the 400 families. So they have bread that day. Maybe the Lord handles that. Maybe the minister, the priest handles it. Somebody handles the distribution. But there's no quid pro quo. I'll give you 2 loaves of bread, give me an orange. That's not how it's done. But when capitalism comes, everything is exchanged. Everything is marketized. Everything has a price. Most of the things that were produced in feudalism never did. This is a famous transaction, a famous transition social. Out of feudalism into capitalism. And everything changed. The Catholic Church, which had been the universal sole church for all of Europe, could not survive the transition. It split in two. You know that as the Reformation. A breakaway of large chunks of the Catholic Church becoming Protestants. And the Protestants tended to be the people where capitalism was going, and the Catholics tended to be stronger where feudalism was still strong. And you can see the remainders of that even to this day in Europe. Very important part of our history. And so on. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because any cataclysmic change from one economic system to another, especially when they are so radically different, has to be processed by people in their mind. They have to have some way of understanding this. Just like in the United States today, people are struggling how to understand this economic crisis. That I have no job, that the job I have isn't secure, that the job I'm studying in graduate school to get probably isn't going to be there by the time I get the degree. And what the hell do I do that? All of those concerns, those people had about the transition they were living through. And a language has to be developed by people going through a way of understanding. Because that's what people do, they try to understand. And the understanding that was arrived at in Europe was very particular. It went like this. We are engaged in a great social transformation. But it was not, in their minds, the transformation I just described to you. It was not a transition from a feudal organization of production, where the serf produced a surplus for the lord, and that ended, and now a proletarian produced a surplus for a capitalist employer. None of that. That's not how they understood it. They understood it in a radically different way. Here we go. They understood their transition, the uniqueness of the new world, as a world in which power had changed. We had gotten rid of the old, centralized, top-down, hierarchical power structures of society. We had literally, in the French Revolution, cut off the head of the king. Very dramatic. We got rid of the king. We said we don't need him, we don't want him, and country after country either obliterated kings, forbade them ever to come back to the United States, or reduced the king to a very bad joke, as in Britain or Belgium to this day. A person who is given a bunch of money to get dressed in strange outfits and appear on 6 holidays a year as if they matter. A bizarre ritual of holding on to something in your history. It was described that this transition was a transition from the realm of unfreedom to freedom, from the realm of monarchy, autocracy, aristocracy, to the realm of democracy and equality. It was a transition between two economic systems articulated, described, understood, not in terms of economics, and certainly not in terms of the class structures, the way I just did for you, but instead in terms of power. And what is unique about the modern world is that we have democracy. We have no king. We are governed by people we select that are responsible to us. Government that can only exist with the consent of the governed. We were very proud of the Declaration of Human Rights, of the American Declaration of Independence, of the British Magna Carta. You know, you learned it all in college. You should remember. It's all about power. Now why? With a transition that at the very least was clearly a profound economic change, would you describe it in language that has almost nothing to do with economics and everything to do with politics? That's a question you have to ask. And here's the answer. Because the overthrow of feudalism, and in the end, feudalism didn't just quietly collapse. The people who sat at the top of feudalism, the big lords, by the way, the biggest lord in every place, that was called the king. The king was just the biggest of the feudal lords. The lords didn't say, well, yes, it's over, see you, we're going to the beach. That's not what happened. The lords tried to hold on, and things became very nasty as more and more people had it with feudalism and didn't want it anymore. But the Lord, and often the Catholic Church, wanted to hold on, and you produce the British revolutions in the 17th century, the French Revolution, the American Revolution in the 18th century. Remember the French Revolution, the quintessential one? In the act of the revolution, here's what they did. They took from the Roman Catholic Church, which had become the largest feudal lord in all of France. That was a wonderful arrangement. If you were a feudal lord and had no descendants, you left your manors to the church. So the church didn't have that problem, right? You couldn't leave it to anybody because you're not supposed to have any progeny. So the church keeps it. And the church accumulated. So the revolution, in case you don't know this, in 1789, the French Revolution takes from the church all its land. It expropriated the church, and the revolutionary government sold the land to French small people, merchants, little folks, who bought the church land, and who thereby, of course, became great supporters of the revolution. But if that revolution had ever undone, they'd lose what they just bought. And the French people are very practical. So in this French Revolution, you transform violently. And you did it all in the name of freedom, and overthrowing autocracy, and having a democratic government. Parliaments, French word, parlement, a place where people speak and work out their problems. Very dramatic, very interesting. Rediscovery of ancient Greek democracy from Athens, and all of that. Why would you talk about it in such political terms, in power terms, and not in economic terms? I think the answer is that the economic change was fundamentally, and I'll use it, a funny word, but it's the way I get it across, disappointing. Because it wasn't a liberation. The serfs weren't liberated from being exploited by the Lord. They may have hoped for that. They may have dreamed it was coming. They may have thrown themselves into battle against the king, hoping, expecting, believing that they would be liberated from their subordinate economic position. If so, they were sorely disappointed, because what they became was no longer serfs, but now proletarians. They were disconnected from the land, and they became people who depended on someone hiring them. And as you've already seen with me, the only reason the capitalist hires a worker is if what he pays the worker is less than what the worker produces and delivers to him. Well, that's not very different from what his position was as a serf, where he worked part of the time for himself and part of the time for somebody else. The proletarian does that too. Or to use Marxian language, feudalism is an exploitative class structure. But so is capitalism. So the transition from feudalism to capitalism is not liberation from exploitation, it's changing the form of the exploitation. You're no longer a serf, you're now a proletarian. By the way, here in the United States, we have a very similar story to tell. In the Civil War in the United States, Abraham Lincoln freed the serfs, the slaves. You're not anybody's slave anymore. But what in the hell does a black man or woman in the South do when they are thrown off the plantation because they're now nobody's slave? They have to go find a job for an employer who will rip them off every bit as much as the slave owner did, maybe more. one of the defenses of the slave supporters in the South was just that. That it's all a hoax, they said to the black folks of the South. We treated you better as a slave because you're our property than you will ever be treated by a person who just wants you to work there, could care less what happens to you. So you really ought to come back to us as slaves because it's a better deal. By the way, there were slaves who agreed with that, didn't it? So there's something that happened in feudalism and the transition to capitalism that's kind of strange. And I want to stress that as we talk about power today. It was a discourse of power through which Europeans, later Americans, understood what had happened. We had gone from the realm of unfreedom to the realm of freedom, from autocracy and monarchy to democracy. It was all about power. That's what people struggled for. That's what the great thing is to achieve. It has produced, I would argue, a fetishization of power in modern European and American society. We are entranced, obsessed by power. We see power as the basic issue everywhere. Who's got the power? We understand struggles in our society in terms of power. The power of the state versus the citizen. That's a big one. The power of whites relative to blacks. The power of males relative to females. Whoa, it's about who's got the power, who's abusing the power, who shouldn't have the power, who should have more power, who should have less. That's it. We see power. This is not an argument that power isn't an important issue. It's an argument that you begin to ask why power has been the issue, the language in which modern society understands what it is.
And you can also look at the modern corporation as an extension of the feudal manor. There are a lot of parallels there. The capitalist, the worker, the lord, the serf, the surplus versus necessary labor going on. Each of these are productive units. And it's no coincidence that the manor, which eventually became a town, towns are incorporated.
And the whole notion of a corporation is like a feudal manor. It's the body of the community, sanctified by Christ. All right, let me turn then, having hopefully presented for you to think about this question, this conundrum, that power is the language of the transition into capitalism. It's what justifies capitalism as a great achievement of human freedom. And therefore it marginalizes, obscures, hides what a Marxist would argue, which is that capitalism is just a change in the exploitative system from what feudalism had been to another kind of exploitation, different, but not a liberation of the mass of working people from being in the exploited position of producing surpluses for somebody else. Okay, let's turn then and examine power, what we all mean and think about power. Here's what I mean and what we'll be meaning for the rest of today. Power is a set of processes. We call them political processes because the word politics refers to power, that's all. That concern how people relate to one another, behavior in the community. So power processes have three kind of parts. There's the process, if you like, of writing the rules, making the rules. Somebody has to make the rules for how we behave. So for example, there's a rule. I cannot, if I'm irritated, walk up to one of you and smack you in the face. There's a rule that says, and if I do it, as you'll see in a minute, things happen because I can't do that. I cannot go in the corner and urinate against the wall. Halfway there. I can't do that, and I can't scream at you, and I can't drive my car onto your lawn. You know, there's all kinds of things I can't do. So that has to be worked out. There has to be a procedure for producing, writing, announcing, whatever you want, the rules of behavior. The second thing that power involves is there has to be an enforcement of the rules. Otherwise, they're just, you make a rule, I make a rule, and we all have a rule, and it has no effect. There has to be an enforcement of the rules. So, for example, if I go up to you and I smack you in the face, you pick up the phone, you call somebody, a policeman who comes and arrests me because I have broken the rules of this community. I can't slap you. So there's making the rules, and then there's enforcing the rules. And the third part of the political process, it's always everywhere, the third part of organizing a system or structure of power is a mechanism to resolve disputes over the rules. That is, I think, I didn't smack you, you threatened me, so it actually was self-defense on my part to hit you, so I'm going to argue, see, I didn't violate the rule because there's a rule about self-defense and blah, blah. Somebody, that has to be worked out. And so there has to be what's called a judicial system or an adjudicational system to resolve disputes. So there have to be rules produced, rules have to be enforced, and disputes over the rules have to be resolved. That has to happen in order for there to be a power system. Second, next system. Power exists in lots of places in society. It's not just the government and us. That's one realm, if you like, one area where power exists. So we had in the government, the legislature, they write the rules. The executive, like the president, who enforces the rules. And the Supreme Court and the judicial system that resolve the disputes over the rules. We got that. But there's also a power structure at specific sites inside a society. For example, a family or a household. There are rules, what you can say, what you can't say, who's to go in this room or not that room, how you organize dinner, how late you can stay out if you're a teenager, you know, the rules. And the rules have to be made, and the rules have to be enforced, and there has to be a mechanism for resolving the rules when there's disputes. Now, all of those can be in the fist of the father. That's one way of organizing it. That should strike you as familiar, because that's like the absolute power of the king in a feudal society. Likewise, in institutions, there is a power structure. The church, it could have a powerful person at the top. We might call him, I don't know, a pope. What has he got? He's the power at the top and runs a top-down institute. So power can be organized that way. Or you could, of course, you could have power organized otherwise. There's a famous Protestant sect. Sect is a word I don't use any pejorative. Denomination, that word doesn't frighten me. In French language, the word sect is just a word for denomination. It has no associated meaning. The Quakers call themselves the Society of Friends. And if you ever go to a Quaker service on a Sunday morning, you'll see that it's organized in a radically different way. They don't have top-down ministerial organization, none of that. The society, the parishioners together refer to themselves as a society of friends, and they all, and their service is often a process in which nobody gives a sermon, but people take turns standing up and saying whatever it is on their minds that Sunday morning, that, whatever, I don't understand any of this, but that's how they do it. Okay. Power is about, then, authority. Another word to use, authority. Who has the authority to do what? The rules specify who gives orders, who takes orders. Who has the authority to do this on this occasion, in that circumstance, in that way, not have the authority. It's a distribution of authority. Given that, the transition from feudalism to capitalism was then understood as a struggle to change one kind of organization of power into another. And the basic transition was understood as the transition from monarchy, aristocracy, autocracy, and so on, to democracy. From all power in the hands of a sovereign, the king, the emperor, the czar, who would make the rules, enforce the rules, and resolve any disputes over the rules. And you know there are societies in the world today that want that kind of a system, or have it. But the general thrust of the last 300 years has been to negate that kind of structure and to replace it with a structure that has the following qualities. Democracy, the people together on an equal footing write the rules, make the rules, enforce the rules, and resolve the rules. Everybody who's in a position to do any of those is chosen by everybody and responsible to everybody and recallable by everybody if anything he or she does is unacceptable. So radically different. The whole story is told like this. So power is about who decides, how the decisions are made, enforced, and adjudicated, and what is to be decided. This is crucial. And so we live in a modern capitalism, all of us, that has been accumulating for 300 years an endlessly repeated and elaborated discourse that the most important thing that has happened in modern society is the transition from undemocratic to democratic political structures. That's what the French Revolution is said to have been about. That's what the transitions in Europe were about. That's what the American Revolution was about. Fill in the blank. And all that has happened in the last 300 years is the good news that from its base in Europe, this democratic revolution has been spread to the rest of the world. That's what George Bush said he was doing. That's what Obama says he is doing. That's what every president of the United States has said is his policy. To bring democracy, i.e. what we already have here, to the poor, backward parts of the world that don't have it yet. Okay? Very important. I don't have the time, but you can now see how a society like this would handle a revolutionary movement such as what happened in Russia in 1917 or in China. Those people might have said, we want to get rid of capitalism and we want to set up a new system socially. No way to understand this. This had to be rewritten, and here's how it was rewritten. Instead of a movement for democracy, this is a regression back to dictatorship, to something that looks a lot like a king, an emperor, or a czar. Stalin is the new czar. And so you denounce this thing, not on the grounds of its economic difference, but on the grounds that it was a regression in this wonderful narrative of the upward march of human beings to democracy, instead of top-down government. So the great critique of the Soviet Union is it's undemocratic, nicely avoiding any conversation about the economics of what they did there. Which is why most Americans, if you ask them today, what is socialism or communism? Their answer is about power. That's when the government does everything. What? What? That's it? That's what you understand? Yes, that's what they understand. Of course they do. And that's not because they haven't been properly educated. That's because it's the dominant, fetishized realm of what counts, of what's important, of what's stressed. Power is the central, obsessive consideration of our time. Last point of this, and then we're going to shift and look at the relationship between class and power. But last point. When you look at this transition from autocracy to democracy, what is it that, in a sense, a Marxist, a critic, also begins to see, besides this obsessive focus on power? Everything is a matter of power. It's a way of people understanding if something's wrong with your life. If you're unhappy with your life, you begin to try to figure out the cause by looking for a power explanation. I am not free. Somebody is doing it to me. Someone has power over me. If I'm an angry black man, it's the whites. If I'm an angry female, it's the male. If I'm an angry citizen, it's the government. It's always a discourse of power. Why are the tea baggers, people with lost jobs, unhappy here in the United States? Why are they upset as they are about the economy, which they said? Why are they angry at the politicians? What happened? What happened there? Why aren't they angry? You know, who lays off workers in the United States? The employers. That's the only person who can do that. So if there are a lot of unemployed people, it means a lot of employers fire them. So if you're angry about unemployment, first place to go is the employer. Not here. Not in the United States. We are immediately angry at the government. It is a political wrong. If only we can change that. We need to have, the French have done this, I don't know if you're aware of it. In French law now, half of all candidates of all parties running for office have to be female. The law. Half of them. You cannot have less than 50%. That's the way it is. Okay. The problem of women in France was power. They didn't have that power, and they needed to get some power. And power, you say, okay, how do we get them power? Let's see. Get more of them into the parliament. It all makes sense once you understand the issue is power. Therefore, the solution is power. Who has the power? Now, here's the interesting thing. Here's the interesting thing about democracy. The people rule. That's what democracy means. People make the decisions. But in a modern government, how's that going to happen? You have hundreds of people. You have thousands. You have millions of people do this. How are you going to get the people to rule if you have millions of people? Say in the United States, we have a population in excess of 300 million people. How does it work? We're all going to get together in a meeting. We don't have a place. What are we going to do? How? Well, we have to. Well, here's what we've done. Once a year, second Tuesday of November, we invite all the people to go into a little booth and press a few buttons. And then to go home. The whole thing takes 3 minutes. It's fantastic. The people rule has been reduced to a caricature. You don't govern if once a year you go into a booth and move a lever. Of course you don't. The only way for the people to govern is if they have the time, the education, and the materials to know what the hell is going on. To know what the issues are, what the options are, and what the choice is, and then to make a choice in the full sense of the word, to debate it, to argue it, to listen to new argument, and to adjust the. Who does that? Answer in this country: nobody. That is done by nobody. You go once a year and you vote. The absurdity of that. The distance of that from a democracy in any of the substantive senses of the term is so stark that we, of course, are not surprised that half the American people do not bother engaging in this charade. Of course, they don't go to vote. And if you give them a speech about how this is your chance to participate, they have a fit of laughter or coughing. Because it's absurd, and you know it's absurd. But we don't do it. But we don't worry about it. We talk about representative democracy. I mean, enormous debates, vast literature about representative democracy. How we have a representative of the people. We elect somebody and they do all the discussions and they learn the issues, maybe, and make the decisions, and we are represented by them. Well, it's already an interesting idea. It raises all the questions about what is a representative, how representative is a representative. We don't worry about that. Power has come to mean not only this fetishization of who has the authority, but it has become degenerate. It's about voting. Much of the United States foreign policy is about getting people to have the elections when they don't have them. What? How hard is that? We have daily mockery in country after country, right? Have elections. Does that mean there's democracy there? No one in this room, I hope, is that naive. Democracy in the United States, half the people don't vote. I worked for years for the Democratic Party in New Haven, Connecticut. During several elections, I worked so hard that I was given a coveted job. I was paid for my work on election day. And here's what I did in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a Democratic Party-controlled city in the United States. The last time a Republican won for mayor of New Haven was 1953. So we have half a century of solid Democratic Party. I worked for the Democratic Party, not the Republican. No fool me. Here's what I did. I arrived at the polls that day on election day, that I was paid, and I was given a van that had been rented. And my job was explained to me. I drive the van to the old people's home on the side of the hill. Big project, big high-rises. I fill the van with 12 old ladies, the men die early, so it's mostly women. I picked up the dozen or so old ladies, and I drove them about 1.5 miles to the polling place. Along the way, I reminded them how lucky they were to have an apartment in this public home for the elderly, which the Democratic Party had gotten for them or for their deceased husband. And that we sure hoped that they would remember who put them in there when we drove them to the polls. I repeated this 3 times, that was the rule. I smiled, I was very fine. Then we got to the polling place, and I informed each of the ladies, which is true, that they have the right, as they go into the polling place, to ask to have a person accompany them to help them cast their ballot. And I assured them that I would be very happy to do that function for them. So I voted 1,000 times. You understand? This is the norm in the United States. I only say it to those of you who've never had a chance to work in an urban political machine in the United States. That's how they work. By the way, the Republicans are just as capable of doing this as the Democrats. Please don't think this is a particular skill of one party or the other. This is how it works. To translate the reality of American politics into the lofty language of democracy requires only an academic who has the faintest idea what's going on. That kind of person can talk about democracy because they do not dirty their hands with looking at what's actually going on. People's lives are dependent on the political party, their jobs are dependent on the political party. They sure as hell are not going to leave it to some abstract notion that they're going to make sure they got the votes lined up. That's how this works. To call this democracy is remarkable, but it's not the least of the remarkable things about how power is an obsessive construct in our culture. Here's a more interesting one. When you say we're going to have a democratic process of decision-making, you're playing a little verbal game with yourself. Because it's not only relevant who participates, everybody, only adult males, only property owners, and we've had all that in the history of democracy. But let's assume we're all agreed everybody should participate. Okay, so one issue is who participates, answer everyone. Another one is how do we participate? Directly or by our representatives? Voting or by some other method? But here's another question. Not just who decides and how we decide, but here's the big one. What do we decide? Every society has to come up with what's to be decided. And don't think it's everything, because it is. Here's something, for example, that is not to be decided democratically. How you have sex with your husband or wife. I picked something as bizarre as I could think of. You don't want, and few societies have allowed there to be a democratic process. That's considered to be your own business. Well, we are a peculiar culture because we do not commit democratic decision in the parliament and the courts about the sex inside the marriage, but we sure do outside. All kinds of rules. What you can do, cannot do, with whom, when, how, and what kind of, very bizarre, but that has to do with our sexual weirdness. But here's the big one. Why not the question, if people in a workplace produce a surplus, wouldn't the commitment to democracy require that there be a democratic decision about how big that surplus is and what is done with it? Geez, I mean, it's like an important issue, don't you think? It shapes the economic life of the society. Will the surplus be used, say, to, I don't know, hire people? Or, I don't know, build a bridge, or fight a war, or decorate a castle? Huh? Here's the interesting thing about democracy, particularly in the United States, but in other countries too. Very important, we struggle who participates and how. But we are not to discuss what. Decide what. What is to be decided democratically? What are the objects of democratic decision, and what are not? Interestingly, everything having to do with production is, by definition, from the beginning, to be kept away. Kept away. Private. Not subject. We needed to develop early on a commitment. I'll quote Thomas Jefferson. That government is best that governs least. Oh. Hello. Democracy is a great achievement, but that government is best, even if it's democratic, that governs least. What's that about? That's another phrase for that, laissez-faire. Laissez-faire in French, let be. Let them do what they want. Let the businesses function without democracy. And so it's fair. Capitalism has always been a system that relegates to the capitalist the decision how to produce, what to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the surplus. That's what a capitalist does, make those decisions. Nobody else makes those decisions. Remember what capitalism is? The workers come to work, 8 o'clock, they stay till 5. They do what they're told with the equipment provided, they produce a product, and at the end of the day, they go home, the product belongs to somebody else. The employer decides what to do with the product, how to produce the product, and what to do with the profits that the production and sale of that product yield. There's no democracy whatsoever. So, question for you. If your class structure, your economic system, is as undemocratic as we know ours to be, then what in the world makes you believe that an undemocratic economic system would be consistent with, could coexist with, a genuinely democratic political system? Isn't it more likely that there'll be a struggle here, and that either the undemocratic economic system will make a political system that serves it, or a genuinely democratic political system will have to transform the economic system to make it consistent with it? The history of modern capitalism is the first of those two options. Lenin is very famous for a remark he made, that modern representative democracy is the ideal political form for capitalism. It lets the capitalists do whatever they want by having democracy. Not about that. While cultivating in the mass of people the illusion that it's one man, one vote, that they have a democratic system, that they are free. Because freedom is carefully understood, without anyone ever saying it, as being something that happens outside the job. Once you step inside the job, kiss your freedom goodbye. You do what you're told. You don't write the rules of what goes on in there. You do not enforce the rules of what goes on in there. You do not resolve disputes about what's going on in there. You do what you're told and you get out. No democracy. And this has to be understood as in the nature of things. Very peculiar. Very peculiar. Okay. A Marxist critique, if you like, of democracy would then be not an argument against everybody participating, on the contrary, and not an argument against direct democracy, on the contrary. But it wouldn't be mainly about that. What Marxian critique of democracy is a critique of the things to be decided in a society that the advocates of democracy have conveniently avoided, marginalized, negated, denied, and hidden. And an insistence, the Marxists, of putting the question of the production, appropriation, and distribution of the surplus in production right in the center of what must be organized in a democratic way if the rest of democracy is to have any genuine meaning. Questions? And so, further note before I make the transition, the awareness that the transition from feudalism to capitalism was conducted in terms of a discourse of democracy and power and the end of hierarchical government. This focus on power that has become our language and our basic way of analyzing whatever's wrong in society and the basic solutions we come up with, which are rearrangements of power. That was an attempt to keep people from coming face to face with the reality that overthrowing feudalism and getting rid of serfdom had not delivered the hoped-for free, open, democratic, egalitarian society. It had produced capitalism, in which the serf was replaced by the proletarian, who was still exploited, although in a different arrangement. Over time, the jarring disconnect between the reality of what most people faced in the new capitalist world of freedom and all of this talk about freedom and democracy produced a psychological, an emotional, and a theoretical explosion, as it always does. If the reality people live and the ideological language within which it's expressed are too far apart, along sooner or later will come people who say, sort of like the child who says the emperor has no clothes. People come along and say, hey, that's not true. We are not all equal. Well, who came along in Europe 40, 50 years after the French Revolution? Who came along and said, you know something, the French Revolution was about liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. That's what it was about. That's what the slogan of Robespierre, Danton, and all the rest were. And here we are in 1848 in Europe. Do we have liberty, equality, fraternity, brotherhood? No. And who was that? Karl Marx. That's the Marxism, the argument that I am articulating for you, is itself the product of what it is explaining. That's why there is a Marxism. Because it says, you know something? This is crazy, this talk about freedom. It doesn't really make much sense. It's a disguise in order to avoid facing something else. Here's what the something else is, and here's why the disguise was useful and necessary. So it's an attempt to explain critically why the disjunction between the hopes and dreams and slogans of the revolutions that overthrew feudalism and the reality of what capitalism is. And that was true in 1848, and that's true now. Okay. Now, how is power different from class? What is it that Marx had to say about all this discussion of power? And the answer is, class is not about the distribution of who gives orders and who takes orders. It's not about legislation or executive or the judicial system. It's about something else in society. Class is about the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus. We've been through that now, several weeks. That's what Marx works out. Every society has to organize who's going to produce a surplus, who's going to get it, and what are they going to do with it. And mostly those who get it have to use it, do something with it, to keep this system going. They distribute the surplus to keep getting the surplus. They have to get it to distribute it, but they also have to distribute it to keep getting it. Marx works that out. Class is that. It's about the production, appropriation and distribution of surplus. It's not about rules in society. It's not about adjudicating or writing them or any of that. Those things are different. Class issue is different from the power issue. A class structure, an organization of society into this way of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus is different from the power structure of a society. Class is something that happens in production. Power happens everywhere. They're very different things. Let me be as concrete as I can to drive home the difference by looking at a capitalist corporation. Who produces the surplus in a capitalist corporation? The workers. We've been through that. Volume 1 of Capital lays all that out. Who appropriates, who draws into their hands the surplus that the workers produce? The employer, the capitalist employer. In a modern corporation, the board of directors. If you actually look at what a board of directors is, if you look at the relevant law about what a board of directors is, you will see that's what they do. They appropriate the surplus. And no sooner do they get the surplus in their hand, then they distribute to the managers, the government is taxed, all the things we went through. So the class structure of a corporation has to do with the workers and the capitalists as they go about connecting to one another in the processes of producing, appropriating, and distributing the surplus. Now let's turn to the question, who decides about all this? Who makes the decisions? For example, how big will the surplus be? Another example. Who will get a distribution of the surplus? How big will everybody's share of the surplus? Those are decisions. Politics, power, is distributed in a capitalist society among lots of people. Let me give you an example, which we've already done, but we'll do it again. The capitalist appropriates the surplus. But the government, a whole other thing, the government comes in and says to the capitalist, you must give me such and such an amount of your surplus, such and such a portion, as a tax on your profits. That's what it's called. Wow, that means that the capitalist must distribute a portion of the surplus to the state. Who had the power to make that happen? The state did. So the capitalist who appropriates the surplus, who distributes the surplus, does not alone have the power to decide how to do that, who to give what share to. The capitalist has to share the power with others. He does not share the distribution, he distributes. The check is written by the board of directors to everybody who gets a cut of the surplus. Nobody else distributes the surplus. Nobody else gets the surplus. But the government has power. By the way, does the government have absolute power? No. The corporation can contest the power. They can evade the power. They can, for example, as you know they do, struggle to rewrite the rules about taxation so that the government is limited, and so forth and so on. Who else has power? I'll give you an example. The banker. The banker goes to the capitalist and says, I want a higher rate of interest on the loans I'm giving you. In other words, I want a bigger cut of the surplus. I want you to distribute more surplus to me and less to others. And the banker has a certain amount of power because he makes credit available, because he knows people, because his daughter married, who knows what all the linkages are. But power is usually quite dispersed. And that's true in a corporation too. But whoever has influence over, remember, the capitalist appropriates the surplus and he distributes it. Nobody else appropriates it. Nobody else distributes it. Now that implies something, doesn't it? If you are a social critic and you want other people in society to have more power over the distribution of the surplus, Notice what you're doing. You're struggling over the power, but you're not struggling over the class structure. You're not struggling over who produces the surplus, who gets the surplus, and who distributes the surplus. You are limiting yourself to a discussion of the power. Let me give you some examples, very concrete. Imagine yourself a third world country. In your country, there is a branch of the General Electric Corporation. The board of directors of General Electric sits in New York, makes all the decisions, including about that subsidiary located in your third world country. You are very angry. They are polluting your country. They're not hiring many of your people. They are underpaying them, whatever. You demand citizens of your own country have at least 6 seats on the board of directors. Let's watch. What are you asking? You are asking for a change in the power relationship. You want to have a different group of people participating in making the decisions. Are you questioning the position of General Motors board of directors as appropriating all the surplus of their workers? No. Are you questioning their distribution? No, they distribute. You want more power over an existing class structure. Let me say that again. You want more power over an existing class structure. You're not changing the class structure. You're not even thinking about it. It doesn't occur to you. You think in terms of power. You're actually imagining, right, that if you put members of your third world community on the board, that will make a lot of other changes. Well, why would you think that? Why would you think that putting, I'll pick a country, Panamanians on the board is going to change anything, including for Panama? You'd have to know in advance that when you put Panamanians on the board, they will affect what the board does more than the board affects them. And there's no possible way for you to know that. Moreover, historically, in case you're wondering, is that ever the case in any kind of general way? Not at all. You know that. You actually know that. But let me repeat it for you. For a long time, there were no women in positions of power in American and European governments. Then we got them. We got Maggie Thatcher. Uh-oh. What? Well, there were people who thought that if women got in a position like that, their nurturance, their different styles, their non-male, all of that would, well, there were 2 possibilities. Those qualities of a female could have reshaped the power structure they entered, or the power structure could have reshaped them. Either way, it can go. And there's lots of reasons to believe that a deeply grounded 300-year-old class structure may be very well equipped to absorb and massage and adjust a power structure change that does not involve a class transformation. Yeah.
At a certain point, if there's enough of a change in the power relation, does it equate a class structure change in the sense that if you demand that workers in a firm have the power to democratically decide what to do with the surplus, what's the difference?
Absolutely. Good question. Could there be, let's call them a sequence or a degree of power changes that eventually get to the point where those who now have more power use it to change the class structure? Of course that could happen. But there's no built-in necessity. And in a country obsessed with power, it's much more likely, and that's the historical record, that people will seek to make a power change. And not only will they not succeed in making a class change, it won't even occur to them. Let me give you some examples that will drive it home. Next week we're going to deal with socialism and communism. I'm going to tease you with one of the things we're going to develop in detail now. The revolution in 1917 in Russia, what does it do? I'm going to jump to the punchline. It changes the power structure in Russia. How does it do that? Well, let's go through it. It kills the Tsar, like the French. Off with the head. Kills the Tsar. Bye-bye. It takes Rasputin and the Russian Orthodox Church and makes it into a minor social institution relative to what it was before. Okay? Keep watering the table. Gotta learn to gesture less. They get rid of the Russian Orthodox Church. They get rid of it, they demote it. They get rid of the Tsar. They create a whole new political structure, the Soviets. Very interesting. They get rid of the market and they substitute government planning. That's a change in the power. Who has the power now to distribute goods? Government planner, not the market transactions. And they take over property. There's no more private property. The government. That's a power change. Remember what property is? Property is only about power. Property is the following thing. I have property because I have the power to deny you something. That's what it means that I have power. I have power over this. I own this thing. What this means is, I have the power to say to you, you cannot touch it, you cannot drink from it, you can't. And I can enforce this. There's rules. That's all that property is. It's a power. Russians changed from private property to socialized property, from markets they checked. Did they change the organization of production in the sense of workers going to work, doing their job, producing a surplus that other people got and distributed? To be blunt with you, no, they didn't. The day after the revolution in Russia, the same workers went to the same factory, sat down next to the same machine, and made the same pair of shoes. The board of directors was no longer the private property of shareholders, it was government officials. Very interesting. That was a change in who had the power over the decisions. But did they change the class structure? Did they go to the workers and say, okay, it is a new world. It's not just that the government took over the property, not just that the government is planning, but you are no longer going to produce a surplus for somebody else. You are now going to be the producer of surplus as you've always been, but here's a new part of your job. You are also going to collectively appropriate and distribute them. Whoa, that would have been a class change. They didn't do that in Russia. Who did? Lenin, Trotsky, trained, sophisticated, genius organizers from the Marxian tradition. So we're not talking about people who didn't know what they were doing. Boy, did they know. They pulled off a revolution no one expected them to be able to achieve. But so deeply were they, as Marxists, caught up in this discourse of power that, like your question, they thought if they could rearrange the power dramatically, far-reachingly enough, it would. Lenin said that. We are on the way to socialism and communism. On the way, very clever. But on the way leaves open, do we get there? He wasn't sure, and that was right. It was good that he wasn't sure, because they didn't. They didn't get there. What they got was Lenin's own statement, a year and a half before he dies. What we have here, he said, speaking about his own society, of which he's the leader, he said we have state capitalism. The capitalist is the state. We have replaced the private capitalists. We've thrown them out. That's a good thing. The state is much better. It's a much better society. We will do better. It's a better thing. We're very proud of it. But it ain't socialism yet. That will only happen when there is no capitalist, neither private nor state. That step, we're not there yet. You know, the subsequent leaders in the Soviet Union did not have the courage, for whatever reason, to be as honest and clear about it as he was.
Where did the surplus go?
The state appropriated the surplus and used it for the things that the state felt were the appropriate things to use it for.
Like electrification, like education?
Absolutely. A lot of social services, what we call collective consumption, things provided to everybody as a matter of their right as a citizen, subsidized education, subsidized housing, subsidized health, and so on. A military, because they were surrounded by enemies, and so forth. Yes, they distributed the surplus, just as before capitalists had. But it's a different kind of society if that is done at the base of society are the people who produce the surplus. This is not a critique. I'm not a Monday morning quarterback. I'm sure I would have done what they did if I'd been in their shoes. That's not the point. But the point for you to see is the notion that if you change the power relations, it will solve your problem. That comes out of the peculiar use of power as a disguised substitute for dealing with underlying economic changes, such as those in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Yeah.
Wasn't there a period prior to 1917 where Russia was still acting as if they were a state capitalist?
Even before 1917, the state was always important in Russia. You know, the state, this is something we're going to do in a few minutes. The state can always be a capitalist. We have examples of that in the United States. The Amtrak system, that's a state corporation. The government is the capitalist. They hire workers, they produce a product, freight moving, passenger moving. You buy the product, it's produced by a proletarian who produces more than he's paid, and the appropriator of the surplus is the government. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which produces electricity in 10 states in that part of the United States, is a government enterprise. The post office is a government enterprise. It employs people, it produces commodities, which it sells in the market. So the notion that the state, you know, is something antithetical to capitalism, that's part of the same caca. See, it's a mistake of politics and class. It's a political change if you get rid of private capitalists and you substitute state capitalists. That's a that says the private people don't have power now and the state does. That's an important, interesting political change. But it is not a class change. It's the same thing as taking over the private enterprise in Bolivia that used to be American or Dutch or French, and now it's Bolivian. Is that important? Sure it is. Will that change things in the country? Of course it will. But it's not a class structural change. Now that's important, because that has consequences. All sorts of consequences. But of course, if the people making a revolutionary change in a society do not have the concept that class is different from power, then they may be satisfied. They may believe the revolution has been achieved when the power has been altered, because the other thing doesn't compute for them. There were many workers in Russia in 1917 who took over their factory, marched proudly to the Winter Palace where Lenin and Trotsky were running the revolution, and said, we've taken over the factory in the name of the Russian people, we've thrown up the capitalists, and we deliver it to you, the representative of the workers' government, to run it in the interests of the people of our country. And the workers went home feeling wonderful that they had contributed to a revolution, fully expecting the next day to go back to work and work. And when they did, they were told by the new government that had taken over this factory, thanks to the workers, that you needed to work even harder now because we're surrounded by enemies and we need all the product we can get, which the workers understood, and they did. Nobody betrayed anybody because nobody understood what I'm trying to explain here and what comes right out of Marx. So you have to understand that class and power influence each other. Of course they do. But they're different. And you do not transform one by fooling around only with the other one. There's nothing automatic here. These are two separate realms of life that can influence and be influenced by one another in countless ways. And if you want a democratic political community, you gotta face the question, is that possible in an exploitative class structure? And can't pretend either that there's no problem there, that's America. Of course we could have democracy, even though our economic system isn't. That's one strange reaction. Or the reaction of some revolutionaries who think, if only you change this, everything else will fall into line. Everything else is derivative, everything else is secondary. Just do this. That's not going to work. The history of the Marxist movement, looking at the world, says that isn't going to work. Folks, I have to push, otherwise we can't get it done. I need to turn now a little bit to the question of the state. Here again, part of what my job is to summarize the theory of the state in Marxism, but also to problematize it. That's part of what I want to do in this class. Okay. Probably the single most summary statement about a Marxist theory of the state is a quote from Lenin again, which says that the state is nothing but the executive committee of the ruling class. A very old idea in Marxism that basically what the state is an arm of, a tool of, a subservient institution for capitalists. So you have phrases like capitalist state, a very strange phrase because it puts an adjective, capitalist, that goes with a class structure in front of something other than a class structure. That's really like saying a red logarithm. It's a strange construction because you don't usually use a color adjective on an abstract mathematical idea. Okay, so a capitalist state, that is, to use sociological terms, it's a very functionalist way of thinking about the state. The state is what it is because it serves a function for something else. In this case, capitalism. And you know where this idea comes from. The police are called in to put down a strike. The army, as I mentioned to you, was called in to control the truck drivers in Greece last week, and so forth. So there's plenty of examples. And it has, again, more than a grain of truth. The state has a complicated relationship in modern society with capitalists. Let's go through it. First, it provides conditions of existence to capitalists. We talked about that at some length 2 weeks ago. And indeed, the state is dependent on capitalists for providing it with funds to perform its activities. Taxes on profits, taxes on service. However, over the years, the capitalists, in an interesting contradiction of their own interests, have worked very hard to push the burden of taxes off of their surpluses and onto their workers. So for example, if you look at the history of the income tax in the United States, it was passed back in the early first decade of the 20th century, and it was passed as a tax that would only hit the top 1% of income earners in the United States. Indeed, it was promised it would never bother anybody else as a way to get it passed. It was a tax on the rich. Over the course of the 20th century, the income tax was moved more and more off of the rich and on to everybody else, so it became the broad-based tax on the mass of people that it is today. So it saved the corporations from having to fund the government. They still wanted the government to provide their conditions of existence, but they didn't want to pay for it. So they pushed the burden of paying onto the mass of people. It's exactly what's going on now with the austerity programs around the world. The cost of dealing with this crisis is being pushed on the mass of people. The problem is, of course, here comes the contradiction, that if you make the mass of people the payers, they demand something from the government. Now the government can't just take care of corporations. It has to do something for the people, or else it faces a tax revolt, which we've had here in the United States. Proposition 2.5 in California and all the similar ones around the country are tax revolts, in which the mass of people are angry because they perceive themselves to be paying a lot more than they're getting. So the government is always, here comes now the punchline in a more sophisticated Marxian view, it isn't just the executive committee of the ruling class. The state is a site in society where all of its contradictions play themselves out. The mass of people want to pay less taxes and get more public services. The corporations want to pay less taxes and get more of their conditions of existence secured. The workers and the capitalists have different demands on the state and different attitudes towards funding the state, and that means there's always, underline the word always struggle and contradiction over what the state is doing and who pays what portion of the state's burdens. But that's not the end of it. Capitalists also lend to the state. That has become extremely important. Governments do not know how to cope with the contradictions. They don't want to displease the corporations because that's where most of their funding comes from. But they don't want to displease the mass of people by taxing them too much because that's where the votes come from. They want to do what these people want. They don't want to tax them. How are you going to run a government? How are you going to do all the things that the corporations and the people want if you can't tax them because you're afraid of their enmity? Solution: you borrow. You go into deficit. Deficit is not about mismanagement, lack of understanding, corruption, bullshit. This has to do with a structural class contradiction playing itself out at the level of the state. The state cannot negotiate these things without making enemies, and politicians don't want to do that, so the solution has been to borrow. The irony of the solution is, who do you borrow from? The mass of the people don't have anything to lend to you, so you have to go to the people you didn't tax, the rich, and lend it, borrow it from them instead, which is what deficits do. They go to those who have it and borrow it. Eventually, you get to a point where the government is becoming so indebted that it may not pay back, then you call that a national crisis, to which we all have to help solve the problem. And how do we do that? We finally tax the masses and cut the social services for them. You finally have the state under the heading of emergency doing what the agenda was for the capitalists in the first place. Pay less to the government, get more from the government services, screw the masses. But instead of doing it directly, you go through the mechanism of deficit accumulation. And then you have the absurd charades, as in the debates between Republicans and Democrats. But we're still not done. Capitalists don't just pay taxes and get services, and don't just lend to the government, they do more. Capitalists buy or lease crucial inputs to their production process from the government. And they also sell significant portions of their output to the government. That is, the government is a major seller and leaseor and a major buyer of capitalist commodity outputs. So it's important, and there's enormous pressure on the government to do all kinds of things from capitalists who depend on the government as their market. Most famous example, military. The military sells to the government. We don't allow there to be private armies. So it's the public army that buys all the defense equipment. So for those in producers, controlling the government, having the government perform in a certain way, having there be a national consensus that we must have a big defense budget is crucial for their survival as capitalists. So they enter in, and they have an agenda that's different from that of other capitalists. All right. The budgets, the policies, everything that happens in the government has to do with all of these conflicting demands among capitalists and between capitalists and workers. Let me give you one example among capitalists. The issue of free trade and protection. Those capitalists who depend on foreign markets don't want any messing around with free trade. They don't want the United States to have tariffs, the United States to have quotas, the United States to punish other countries. Why? Because they fear retaliation, which will hurt their profits. So those people want the government to support free trade. On the other hand, there are capitalists who are being wiped out by the competition coming in from China, from India, and elsewhere. They want the government to stop it. And by the way, both of them mobilize the working class to support their different agendas. So you get the companies that want there to be an opening up of trade with Mexico and Canada, free trade, and they say to the workers, you'll all be better off, you workers, you should support NAFTA, the free trade zone. And the other side saying to the workers, you should not support NAFTA. They're going to kill your jobs, they're going to move them to Mexico, it's going to... That's a fight among capitalists. Each of them tries to enlist the workers to win the power of the government to go one way or the other. The tragedy is only that the workers listen to this horse shit. There's no way to know which is better for workers, free trade or not. It never has been. Back in the over a century ago, Karl Marx wrote an essay called On Free Trade. If you have a copy of the Philosophy of Poverty, a very famous book that Marx wrote, typically in English translations of the Philosophy of Poverty, that's a critique of Proudhon, who was another socialist at the time. At the back of that book is a reprint of that essay on free trade. Read it. There Marx explains the job of the working class is a critique and a change and an overthrow of capitalism. It is not to get caught up in the debates between one group of capitalists and another. That's not our issue. That's a very profound way of teaching what we've been talking about all day today. The issue is class for a Marxist, not power. Not the power of NAFTA versus the power of not NAFTA. And not because we're not interested in power, of course we are. We like democracy rather than autocracy, of course we do. But that's a different issue, and to be handled as just one issue alongside the class issue. And indeed, Marxists emphasize and focus on the class issue precisely because 99% of the other champions of democracy don't. They don't recognize it, they don't focus on it, they don't understand it as different from power, and they don't make it part of their agenda. So while Marxists should certainly do that for them, it should do it knowing that they don't return the kindness. And that therefore Marxists have a kind of an obligation, which is what these lectures are about, to put that class question on the agenda, to stress it enough that it doesn't slip again out of the story and get lost in an orgy of celebration of democracy, which is, as I say, 99% not substantive, and mostly a way to disguise and distract people from the class issue, which is the function of the focus on power from the beginning of capitalism, as I've tried to show. Okay, folks, we've run out of time. I promise we will revisit all of these issues during our last session, 1 week from today, when we will deal with the rise and fall of socialism and communism in the 20th century, mostly the Soviet Union, a little bit also on China and others, because all of that rise and fall of that most important to date experiment in a socialist change has enormous lessons for us, but touches all the issues. How capitalism works, power versus class, and the household. Because the transformations that did and didn't happen inside Russia after 1917 are as important a part of the story of the collapse of socialism there as anything else. So we will, in a sense, recapitulate, even though the focus will be on socialism. A French writer, much influenced by Marxism, but not strictly speaking a Marxist, but you've heard of him, I would guess, was Michel Foucault. Spelled this way, for those of you that are not familiar with French spelling, Foucault, Michel Foucault. If you read any of his modern major books, and they've all been translated into English and are available in paperback, you'll see he's fascinated by the changed way of thinking that happens about 300 or 400 years ago, having mostly to do with power. So he writes about prisons. We didn't have those things before. We developed a place to put a person who violates the rules that govern our behavior in the community. And we have to segregate them, put them in a special place where they can't do the bad thing, which is to break the rules. And he's fascinating. It's called Discipline and Punish, if I remember the name of the book. But there's all kinds of studies. He shows how we had to develop a different concept of sexuality, more later in his books. He developed a concept of psychological disturbance, a concept of illness. All of those things developed then in a radically different way, if they even existed before. So power became very important 300 or 400 years ago. Why? Because it was the language, the theory, the ideology in which a basic social change happened in Europe. And that social change was the transition from an economic system called feudalism to an economic system called capitalism. Let's review quickly so we all know what I mean. Roughly 1,000 years, roughly 500 to 1,500 AD in Europe, there was an economic system called feudalism. In a feudal system, there were basically two positions a human being has. You were either a serf or you were a lord. If you were a serf, you had a place on this earth that you were born into by virtue of your parents, and you cultivated the land in a place that you were born into. Okay? If you were a lord, you presided over an area of land on which were positioned lots of these serfs. And here's how the economy worked, roughly. 3 days a week, the serf worked on the piece of land that he or she had inherited. It was a highly male-structured and male-dominated environment, so it's really the men. The women were adjuncts to the men and clearly subordinate. So the man worked with his wife, of course, 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, on the land they had been born into. The other 3 days of the week, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they went to the land of the Lord, where there were no serfs living, and they worked on that. Sunday, of course, Christians, they rested. The first 3 days, when you worked on a little piece of land that was yours, you were assigned to, you kept the fruits of your labor. That's how you lived. You and your family kept whatever you could grow, whatever you could cultivate, whatever animals you could sustain in those 3 days of the work. The fruit of your 3 days of labor on the land of the Lord belonged to the Lord. To use Marxian language, the first 3 days, the serf did necessary labor because the serf retained the fruits of that labor. The second 3 days, the serf was doing surplus labor because the fruits of that automatically belonged to the Lord on whose land he worked. That's how people lived, more or less, for 1,000 years. There were variations we don't need to spend time on. That system lasted a long time, but around 1600, it fell apart. And again, very interesting story, we don't have the time. As it fell apart, the large, they were called manors, the large units where there was a lord and serf. By the way, a lord could have 20 serfs. A lord could have 20 villages, each with 500 serfs. It could be very large. And everything in between. What began to happen as the system broke down is the lord could not enforce the labor of the serfs. The serfs couldn't stand the life they had if half of their labor went to somebody else, so they would run away. You know the stories. No one has ever explained to you what they were, but for example, one of the famous stories of the serf. So it's what was part 4 on the outline, the third of our 4 topics, and it has to do with power, class, and the state. So let me begin dealing with that. The issue of power has been, for at least 300 years, the dominant issue in Western societies. What do I mean? I mean that by power, I refer to the question of how a society organizes the rules of behavior. Who is going to give orders? Who is going to take orders? How are the orders to be given? How is the right to give orders to be distributed in the society? What are all the rules governing who makes decisions? Who has to live with those decisions? Who participates, etc.? These questions of power have been the dominant questions for 300 years. The symbol, or the signal, if you like, that power is such a central issue has been the importance of words like freedom, understood in terms of not being subject to power, being free of subjection to power. Democracy, which is about how you organize the power to make decisions. Notice, freedom, democracy, liberty. These are all terms that have to do, if you think about it, with the organization and the distribution of power. Take a step back and ask yourself the question, why would people be so interested in the question of power? If you took the time to study, for example, European history before 300 years ago, you will discover that they weren't all that interested in power. They were much more interested in religion. They were much more interested in a whole host of issues, not power. There's something special that happens about 300 or 400 years ago that makes power the central issue. One of the best writers on this starts to run away because they can't stand a feudalism that's breaking down is the story of Robin Hood. You become a bandit in the forest because you have to live somehow, and you no longer can live in the old way. By the way, in most of European feudalism, just so you understand, there is no private property. The serf does not own the land he works on, nor does the lord. There is no property. The church would denounce anybody who talked about my land. And here's the reason. Roman Catholic doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, for those of you who need to go back, or Augustine. Human beings cannot own the land because God put the land here. God put the people here. For a person to take unto himself what is God's product is a blasphemy beyond words. Can't be. Private property in land is an anathema, a sin, a blasphemy. Very important to understand this. So land was a collective, there was no private property in land. Here's something else there wasn't. No hired labor. Nobody paid another person to work. Wage labor didn't exist. That was not how anything was organized. Feudalism doesn't have wage labor. Feudalism is a personal relationship that lasts through the generations between one group of people, serfs, who've entered into a relationship, I talked to you about that last time, because it's like modern marriage, with a lord. And that relationship imposed on both parties their behavior that in Marxian theory we analyze as the production of a surplus by one group, the serfs, and its receipt by another group, the lords. What did the lords do with the serfs? Very similar to what we did 2 weeks ago with the corporation. The lord had to distribute the surplus he got from the serfs to keep this system going, just like a board of directors of a corporation has to distribute the profits, the surplus they get, to keep the system going. How did the feudal lords do it? Just a reminder. They gave a portion of it to the church because it's expensive to build a cathedral. It's expensive to house, feed, and clothe the Monsignor and the priests and the nuns and all the other personnel of the church. But they were crucial because they said to the mass of serfs, this is how God wants us to live. You are to be a serf. When life is over, you will sit on the right hand of God like anybody else. But for the meanwhile, until you get there, you are a serf, he is a lord, and this is how it ought to be. So for you to reject the role of the serf would be to set yourself against God, which probably isn't a good idea. It's really very important. What else did the Lord do with the surplus? He had a bunch of gentlemen with long sticks called lances. And to make them look very scary, he put them on a horse and wrapped them in metal. Scared the shit out of the serf. That's the point. Because if the serf was interested in not being a serf anymore, he'd get a visit from 3 very large people on a big horse wrapped up in foil. And this was a very scary sight. Plus, if you really misbehaved, they would stick you with the stick. Not a good idea. And these, but of course, a horse has to be fed. A knight, that's what they were called, had to be fed. His horse had to be housed. The foil was expensive. All that. So this was another use of the surplus. So this was a very complicated system. And in case you're wondering, not much of a market. No need for markets. Most of these manors were self-sufficient. The serfs, part of the serfs made grain, part of the serfs raised chickens, part of the serfs, spun wool into material. These were largely self-sufficient. There was some trade, but the point is, you didn't need markets. That's not the way this was organized. So, you with me? No private property, no wage labor, no markets, no profits, none of that. It's a very different system. Not capitalism. It lasted in Europe 1,000 years. It has lasted in other parts of the world longer. By comparison, capitalism is relatively young. But in the 15th century, for a whole host of reasons, this feudalism fell apart. And serfs kind of took off on their own.